I got a brand new sweetie, better than the one before. Oh, she's got everything and a little bit more.
Hello, and welcome to Additional History, Headlines You Probably Missed. I'm your host, Tiffany Clark, and this is episode 264 of the podcast. If you want to reach out to me for any reason, you can do so at additionalhistory@gmail.com. This episode is available on whatever podcast listening service you like the best, probably what you're listening to right now. Or if you prefer, you can watch it over on YouTube and see the actual headlines and pictures for yourself as I talk about the stories. This episode is being released on a random day, instead of on a Monday, in case you didn't notice. Since I live in the United States, I wanted to do an episode in honor of the country's 250th anniversary, which is today. I thought about covering the lives of some of our founding fathers, or telling stories from the Revolutionary War. But ultimately, I decided to tell stories that were being printed in newspapers on random 4ths of July throughout the last 250 years. Much like one of my random clippings episodes. We don't have a lot of preserved newspapers from 250 years ago. But the Pennsylvania Evening Post out of Philadelphia was operating and published a newspaper that very day. That same newspaper was the first to print the Declaration of Independence, too, and they did that just 2 days later, on July 6th, 1776. I had fun doing the research for this episode, and I hope you have fun listening to the stories that I found for you. Are you ready? Here we go. For my first anniversary story, I decided to see what was being printed exactly 1 year after the Declaration of Independence was signed and made official. The American Revolution was still very much going on, and it would be for quite a few more years. But life still had to go on for those living in the colonies. This first tidbit comes from the Virginia Gazette out of Williamsburg, Virginia. First, before I tell you about the actual story, I want to note that underneath the name of this newspaper, it said in big, bold letters, "The freedom of the press is one of the great bulwarks of liberty and can never be restrained but by despotic governments." This was interesting to me since freedom of the press ended up being part of the First Amendment to the Constitution, so it was obviously something that had been important to people in the colonies for many years. Now, there wasn't a headline for this article, and it was pretty much just a plea for help. It seems that a man by the name of Richard Blanks woke up one day to find that his horse had been stolen right out of his pasture. He said it was a yellow bay that was 5 or 6 years old. It stood at 4.5 feet tall, and it had a noticeable black streak on its rear end. Richard promised that anyone who found his horse and brought it back, or gave him information that would lead to getting his horse back, would get $5. Now, $5 doesn't seem worth the effort for most, but back then it would have been more like our $150 to $200. And horses were very important back then. This horse might have been Richard's only mode of transportation, or maybe he was a farmer and needed the horse to pull his plow. Well, there was one last thing Richard included in his plea, and that's the reason I'm sharing this story. He said he would also give £5 if the thief was convicted. But there was an exception to that. He'd only give the money if the thief was a white man. Now, I don't know about you, but I was a little confused by that last part. Did that mean if it was found out that the thief was a Native American, or maybe an enslaved person of a different color, that he wouldn't give $5? Or he would just let them have the horse and not worry about it? It's also interesting to note that it was $5 for information and £5 for conviction. So maybe it had something to do with the war, too. Who knows? Hopefully Richard found his horse. For my next headline year, I wasn't really sure which one to pick. I mean, there are 250 years to choose from. How would I narrow it down? Well, I did the sensible thing, and I went online and I asked my computer to randomly spit out a year between 1776 and 2026. It obeyed me because it's a computer, and it has to. And that's how I got this random year and story. This date is July 4th, 1839. And I'm taking a story from page 2 of the Rochester Daily Advertiser out of Rochester, New York. The headline says, "Attempt at Abduction and a Row." This story took place in the town of Ogdensburg. It's a small town that's right across the border from Canada in upstate New York, right there along the St. Lawrence River. Apparently, some guy decided to leave Canada and cross to the United States. I have no idea if he'd been in the U.S. for a long time or a short time, or if he was a criminal or the salt of the earth. All I know is that some people didn't like that he had deserted Canada. So, they decided that they were going to kidnap him and take him back to the country themselves. The group of kidnappers met up with the deserter, and they began talking to him. They were friendly and made the man feel safe and not the least bit worried. Then they started plying him with alcohol, probably hoping to get him so drunk that he would pass out and they could just carry him away. Their plan probably would have worked, except the kidnappers couldn't resist the draw of the alcohol themselves, and while they were getting the deserter drunk, they got drunk too. Drunk people tend to spill secrets, and that's what happened in this case. The men started telling people about their kidnapping plans, and those people they told spread the rumor to other people, and as the newspaper described it, the news spread like wildfire. And before the kidnappers could do anything about it, they were surrounded by a mob of angry people. What did the mob of people do? They hauled the would-be kidnappers outside and coated them in tar. No mention whether or not feathers were used too. This attack on the kidnappers went on for some time, and I guess the noise was loud enough that it started to draw more attention. Some of that attention came from a group nearby. I'm assuming military men of some sort, who were working on their drills with their muskets. They decided to act as an armed guard, and took over the situation, and marched the men back to their boat while they were unceremoniously forced back across the border to Canada. Don't worry, the Rochester Daily Advertiser took it upon themselves as a newspaper to remind people that no matter how deserving the bad guys might be of such punishments, it's always better to take care of the matters like that with the proper due course of law, rather than with a mob and a bucket of tar. According to the article, one of the men took his own life the next day. Since it worked well last time, I decided to use the random number generator again for this next story. This time it gave me the year 1984. That's quite a leap forward from 1839. Although it's not the subject I'm going to cover right now, I do want to mention that during the 4th of July in 1984, the Statue of Liberty, a symbol of freedom for the United States, was undergoing major renovations. Right before the holiday, the torch that Lady Liberty holds was completely cut off and lowered to the ground. A new torch was built to replace the original, and the statue was rededicated 2 years later on the 4th of July. Now to the 1984 story. This one comes from the Stamford Times out of Stamford, Connecticut, but it took place in New Mexico. The headline says, "Confined Woman is Freed by Police." My first thought upon reading that headline was that some woman had been kidnapped and the police were able to find her and save her, but that's not the story at all. Let me read you the opening lines. It says, "A woman whose husband kept her locked in a cage-like bedroom was freed after police received a tip that she hadn't been seen for 2 years," authorities said. "No charges were filed, and no charges are likely," a lawyer said. Wow, okay, my first reaction was shock that a man could lock his wife up for that long, and sadness that nobody reported her missing for 2 years. And then as I kept reading, my shock turned to horror and anger that the husband wasn't going to be charged. I know times were different in the, quote, olden days, but this was 1984, not 1584. I'm guessing that those of you listening to this episode are probably having the same reaction that I did. But this is one of those stories that shows us that we need to make sure we get all of the details before we grab our torches and our buckets of tar, like in the last story. It's the reason why we have a justice system, flawed as it sometimes is. The woman who was found locked up was 43-year-old Bonnie Missany, although I will say that at least one other record says she was only 33. Anyway, her husband Frederick had been keeping her in a bedroom with a steel mesh door and windows that were covered in heavy metal screens. The first sheriff's deputy that entered the room said it smelled like urine and feces, and the bedding and the carpet were both really dirty. Bonnie's hair was matted and obviously hadn't been taken care of in a while. Anytime someone would try to go near Bonnie, she would attempt to bite them and scratch them. She yelled out obscenities at those trying to help her. The situation was so bad, the police had to sedate her just to take her to the hospital for an evaluation. According to 50-year-old Frederick, Bonnie had suffered from some sort of multiple personality disorder since 1969. At times, she thought she was Jesus Christ. Other times, she believed she was Satan. She'd been institutionalized off and on in Michigan, in Arizona, and in New Mexico. But according to Frederick, the last time she was in the hospital, one of the orderlies brutally assaulted her, and that made her afraid of uniformed men. To keep her safe in a broken system, Frederick decided to keep her at home and try to take care of her himself. Except it was easier said than done. The initial reports said that Frederick wouldn't be charged, but that did change, and he had to go to trial. According to his lawyer, he was a compassionate man who was just trying to do the best he could with a very difficult situation, in a system that is broken. Frederick told the courts that his wife had been doing better for a little while, and she would freely move about the house and watch TV and things like that. But then some of the neighbors started taunting her, and her mental health started to decline again. Sometimes she would go into that room by herself, and sometimes when she was having a really bad day, he had to lock her in there to prevent her from sticking things in the electric outlets and pouring water into them. At least one person who ran a mental health clinic said that he had classified Bonnie as psychotic, and that her feeling the urge to attack the electric outlets was one of the most common hallucinations of those suffering from schizophrenia. At the hospital, where Bonnie was evaluated after being let out of the locked room, they had to cut her matted hair to clean it, and help her with some hygiene things, but they said she looked to be in good health, and she didn't seem to be malnourished. Well, leading up to the trial, the courts had a doctor evaluate Frederick, too. And according to one, Frederick suffered from paranoia. It was implied that the abuse Bonnie suffered from orderlies when she'd been in past mental health facilities never happened, and was actually a product of his paranoia. The same thing went for his belief that the neighbors were spying on him and Bonnie and harassing them. So, what do you think? Who was in the wrong here? According to the jury, they couldn't decide either. After hours of deliberation, they were deadlocked, and the judge declared a mistrial. That was in March of 1985. In August, the prosecutor decided to dismiss the charges against Frederick. I don't know what the circumstances were, but I believe Bonnie died just a few years later. For my next random year, I asked my family to pick random years from the last 250 years. One person chose 1877. So I opened the first newspaper I saw on my list and got a story off the first page. This story comes from the July 4th, 1877 edition of the Edwardsville Intelligencer out of Edwardsville, Illinois. This story actually has a headline, and it's the reason why I chose to tell this story. It says, "Fight Between Spinsters." This is the kind of old story that I love. It came in a time when newspapers weren't afraid to air everyone's dirty laundry in the newspapers. Since the article is short, I'm just going to read the whole thing to you. It says, It was a hand-to-hand engagement between Annie Owens and Sarah Jones, who could not, even under the subduing influence of a soul-inspiring sermon, control their passions. The fight occurred on the 20th, during divine services in a church in Ixonia. The girls entered the church and unaccountably both occupied the same seat. While the rest of the congregation were attentive listeners to the sermon, Sarah Jones arose from her seat and raised a window nearby to get a little fresh air. This did not suit Miss Annie, who was seated by her side, and she instantly got up, leaned over her enemy, and spitefully pulled the window down. The slight indignity led to a few epithets, and the window was again raised, and as quickly pulled down. Then Sarah struck Annie with a book over the left eye, and the engagement threatened to be fierce and determined for a time, but a few women stopped it. After the services, care was taken not to permit the belligerents to get at it outside. They had the satisfaction, though, of shaking fists at each other. For my next story, I went back to my random year generator, and out popped the year 1937. This year immediately jumped out because there was something very historically significant happening on July 4th, 1937. Something that is still talked about all the time, even today. I'm taking this headline from the Beaumont Enterprise out of Beaumont, Texas. A very big, bold headline on the front page says, "Fear for World Flyers mounts." Friends, Amelia Earhart disappeared on July 2nd, 1937, 2 days before the national holiday that year, and the country was very worried. But at this point in time, people were still trying to be optimistic. Even Amelia's husband was telling reporters that Amelia and Fred Noonan were probably sitting on an island somewhere, sending out distress signals, and just waiting for rescuers to arrive. I don't think anyone at that time believed that the Great Flyer's disappearance would become one of the most talked about, unsolved mysteries of all time. Another woman pilot, Ruth Elder, said that she was sure Amelia made an at-sea landing, and that she was probably just floating there, waiting for rescue. Ruth was in a unique position to know how that felt, since she had made an emergency landing into the Atlantic Ocean while trying to cross from New York to Paris a decade earlier in 1927. She said she only had to wait an hour until a rescue ship came by, but it was still nerve-wracking. Article after article filled the front page, and even some of the interior pages of this specific newspaper that day. It was pretty much the only thing being talked about. But since I already covered this subject in episode 65, 5 years ago, I'm going to move on to our next story. Okay, this next story comes from the Cocker City Public Record out of Cocker, Kansas. This is going to be the final story of this podcast episode, and I'll admit that to pick the year for this last story, I purposely searched for Independence Day newspapers with juicy murder stories. Many of the stories I tell on this podcast end up being murder stories, since that's the kind of thing that sells newspapers and makes headlines. So I figured I might as well find one that took place near or on the holiday. This story will not disappoint. It comes from the July 4th, 1901 edition. The headline says, "Is again in jail." I read many newspaper articles about this story, but then I found a website called Midwest Killers that condensed it all, which was super helpful, since this story could take hours to tell. So I'm grateful for their help. Now, this story was an ongoing story. Some might say it started a year earlier, in July of 1900, but it actually started a few years earlier than that. There are 3 main characters in the story. One of them doesn't make it out alive. Our first character is Clara Wiley. Clara was born in Ohio in 1874, the daughter of Roland and Nancy Wiley. The second character is Jessie Morrison. She was born a couple of years before Clara, in 1872 in West Virginia. But her family eventually moved to Kansas, and her father became a probate judge there in El Dorado. And our third character was Guy Olin Castle. He went by Olin, and he was born in 1876, most likely in Ohio. Now, as often happened in old newspapers, details weren't always accurate as far as dates and ages go. At least one source reported that Jesse was a full 10 years older than the others. So I'm going with the dates etched on their headstones. Well, back in the late 1800s, just before the turn of the century, when Clara was 18 years old, her family moved from Ohio, the only home she'd ever really known, to El Dorado, Kansas. There she met Jesse Morrison. Clara was a very kind and sweet person, and people liked to be around her. It didn't surprise anyone that she quickly made friends with people in El Dorado. She was invited to many social events. She also got involved with a local church group. That's where Clara met Jesse, who was also a member of the group. Jesse's life had been harder than Clara's, and she lost her mother when she was pretty young. But she had made the best of it, and people liked her too. She had a stepmother that she seemed to get along with, and Jesse also had a lot of friends and social invitations. She worked at a department store there in El Dorado called The Racket. Then, a few years later, in 1897, Olin Castle entered the picture. He'd actually lived in El Dorado with his family earlier in life, but they moved away for a while and then returned. He too was well liked, and had no problem renewing old friendships. He got a job working at the Racket department store too, and he and Jesse hit it off, and a friendship began. But that's all it was, at least in Olin's mind. Jesse liked him as more than a friend, though. But Olin just didn't see her that way. He had eyes for someone else in town. Yep, you guessed it. Olin was falling for Clara Wiley. Despite his feelings for Clara, Olin remained friends with Jesse, and when they finished their shifts at the department store, he would often walk her home at night. He became friends with her siblings, too. In Jesse's mind, their relationship as a couple was growing. In Olin's mind, he was just making sure a friend made it home safely each night. Jessie was a talented seamstress, and she started showering Olin with homemade gifts. She especially loved to sew neckties for him, and he would proudly wear the gifts she made. But the closer Olin and Clara became, the more Jessie seemed to ramp up the gifts and attention that she gave to Olin. She would even go so far as to try to flirt with him in front of Clara. Jessie had quit working at the department store, but she still hung around there all the time, mostly trying to talk with Olin. At first, Clara put up with it, but eventually the relationship between Jessie and Olin started to bother her. She and Olin had officially become engaged, and she didn't think it was appropriate for Jessie to carry on the way she was, or for her fiancé to accept gifts from another woman. She put her foot down, and Olin agreed. He stopped wearing the gifts from Jessie, and he tried to avoid her when he could. Jessie could sense that he was slipping away from her, so she started spending even more time at the department store. Clara and Olin's wedding was getting closer and closer, and it seemed that Jessie was desperate to win him over before it was too late. Jessie began to write letters to Olin, but he refused to read them. She started following him home, even when he was leaving Clara's home. She even vaguely threatened him at one point. She was obsessed and would not back down. Well, on June 13th, 1900, Clara and Olin were married. It was a beautiful ceremony, and the couple was truly happy. They couldn't wait to spend the rest of their lives together. They moved into their own home there in El Dorado and began their new lives as a married couple. And then one day, about 9 days after the newlyweds were married, a neighbor overheard Clara standing in her doorway, chatting with another woman. It sounded like two old friends catching up. But after a few minutes, their voices were raised, and it seemed as if they were arguing. Soon, the neighbor heard screams. At this point, the neighbor ran outside to see what was happening in the castle's home. She looked through the window and could see Jessie Morrison kneeling next to Clara Castle. Clara was surrounded by blood. Another neighbor who had also heard the screams arrived, and together the two women forced their way into the home. Jessie looked up at the women and said, "She tried to kill me." Clara's throat had been slit, but Jessie had multiple cuts on her arms and neck too. This is how Jessie's injuries were described. Quote, "The wounds on the left side of her neck were quite deep, that both circled clear around the front of the neck from ear to ear. There was one wound on her shoulder and two on the arm just above the elbow. The shoulder wound and the upper one on the arm were deep. There was another wound over the clavicle. Two of her fingers were also cut. She was bleeding profusely, but there was no obvious hemorrhaging." A doctor arrived, and he performed surgery on Clara, right there in the kitchen table, doing everything he could to stop the bleeding and save her life. Sadly, though, things weren't looking too good for the young newlywed, and the authorities wanted to get as much information from her as they could before she passed. Clara's throat had been damaged so much she couldn't speak, but she could write, and write she did. Clara claimed that it was Jessie that had started it all, and that Jessie had tried to kill her. Which of the two women was telling the truth? Clara fought for her life, and it seemed that she might make a miraculous recovery after all. But then she took another turn, and she couldn't recover that time. She passed away on July 10th, 1900. She had been married for less than a month, and she was buried in her wedding dress. Well, with the death of Clara, the authorities had no choice but to arrest Jessie and charge her with murder. Her trial began in the last weeks of 1900. The prosecution put Olin on the stand and had him give all the details of what was basically stalking on the part of Jessie. Witnesses who had seen how she acted toward him also testified and corroborated his story. But then it was the defense's turn to take over, and they put Jessie herself on the stand. She pretty much denied everything that Olin said, and insisted that when they did have interactions with each other, Olin was the instigator. Jessie also denied that the attack happened the way Clara had written on notepads in her dying days. She insisted that she was the victim, and that the cuts on her body had been inflicted by Clara when Jessie tried to escape. The defense called a man named A.J. Morgan to the stand. He claimed he was in town on business that day, and stopped by the Castle home. After he left and was walking away, he heard Clara knock on the screen door and call out to Jessie, who was walking by, to come over and talk to her. So, which of the women was the victim? Although to some it seemed pretty clear-cut, the jury wasn't so sure. They didn't believe Olin's testimony, and they felt sorry for Jessie and believed her words on the stand. After much deliberation, they gave up on coming to a consensus. 9 jurors out of 12 wanted Jessie acquitted, and only 3 believed she was guilty. It was a hung jury, and Jessie walked out of the courthouse as a free woman. This brings us to July 4th, 1901, the Independence Day date of this story. Jessie Morrison's second trial had just concluded. That time the prosecution decided not to have Olin testify, and it worked. The jury convicted Jessie of second-degree manslaughter, and she was sentenced. Are you ready for this? To 5 years in prison. She had deliberately stalked and killed Clara Castle, but she was only given 5 years in prison. Jessie's team of lawyers thought that even 5 years was too much. They were convinced that since their case had produced a hung jury once, they could do it again. They appealed, claiming that multiple jurors had admitted previous bias towards Jessie. The state Supreme Court agreed, and Jessie's conviction was overturned. She was free again. But the prosecution wasn't done just yet. They decided to put her on trial for a third time. That trial came a year later, 2 years after Clara had died. The trial pretty much went the same way the second trial went. Jessie testified, but Olin didn't. During the third trial, though, the defense introduced a new witness, J.C. Brownfield. Like A.J. Morgan in the first trial, Mr. Brownfield claimed that he was visiting El Dorado the day of the incident. And in fact, he just happened to be walking by the Castle home at the same time as Jesse. He witnessed Clara call Jesse over and initiate the interactions between the two, just like Jesse had said. But no, the prosecution was quickly able to prove that J.C. Brownfield had not been in town that day. He'd been in and out of jails in the area, and he was charged with perjury for lying at Jesse's trial. As a side note, Brownfield was sentenced to 5 years in prison for that perjury. He got the same sentence Jesse had been originally given, even though she had killed someone. Maybe it's just me, but I found that to be odd. Well, that trial wrapped up and Jesse was once again found guilty of second-degree manslaughter. Except this time, she was sentenced to 25 years in prison. Her family was horrified. Her friends were horrified. Everyone that believed her story was horrified. They appealed her case all the way to the Supreme Court again. At that time, a new trial wasn't granted. They turned to the governor, begging him for a pardon, but he refused. When a new governor took office, they asked for a pardon from him, but he refused too. Same with the third governor. Her family told that governor that their father was sick and unlikely to live much longer, and wouldn't it be nice if he could die with Jesse by his side? They also said it wasn't fair that she was originally sentenced to 5 years and then ultimately given 25 years behind bars. A year after he originally said no, the governor changed his mind, and Jessie Morrison was released from prison after serving 8 years for the death of her former friend. Olin moved to California and got remarried, and eventually Jessie found the real love of her life and was married to that man for more than 50 years before his death. Oh, and her father lived for nearly a decade after she was let out of prison. It seems that in this case, it was only Clara that really lost.